Hi, I'm Michelle Rosneck, and I am the manager of the social workers and the chaplains here at the VNA Hospice and Palliative Care.
And I'm Andrew Tripp, one of the chaplains here at VNA Care.
Today, Andrew and I are going to discuss an article that we came upon while reviewing information pertaining to end-of-life care for our veterans. The article is called Wounds of Suffering, Soul Injury, Moral Injury, PTSD. The use of the term soul injury was a result of 5 nurses' work with 10,000 veterans over 3 decades. It was during this time that they uncovered some commonalities between the term insidiously acquired wound and what the veterans reported as feeling that they had lost the sense of self or personhood. Later, they would come to refer to it as an injury to their soul. In 2013, after compiling years of compassionate awareness and understanding and knowledge, these same 5 nurses started a nonprofit organization called Opus Peace. Now, I think the best way to maybe present this article is through identifying these vestiges with a case that we've worked with. Andrew, I think you mentioned you had a case.
I do. That I had a patient who was a Special Forces member of the military, retired, and his work occurred primarily during the drug wars of the 1980s. By the time that he came onto hospice, he had really drank his liver away as a result of self-medicating the moral injury, the PTSD, the soul injury with alcohol. He had had a brief period of sobriety, had been married, had a daughter, but then had fallen off the wagon, had left the family because he didn't want, especially his daughter, to see him in, the really chronic alcoholic state. And when he realized he didn't have long left to live, he returned back home to be with his family, really to be with his family to die. It had been several years since he had seen his daughter, and he was really convinced that he did not deserve forgiveness. He was convinced that he was going to hell as a result of the actions that he engaged with, both in self-medicating with alcohol as well as the actions that he engaged with in the midst of the drug wars. And it was because of that moral injury and because of that spiritual harm that had been done to him that the notion of forgiveness at first seemed impossible. At first, I knew we were going to have to engage this in baby steps, that you can't convince him that his daughter's going to forgive him. You can't convince him that he'll be able to forgive himself. You have to work on how do you just handle the shame when you see her? How do you have a conversation so you can enjoy the time that you have remaining with her? How do you let her know that you love her? How do you say those words? And how do you make her feel that sentiment? And how do you accept that you were doing your duty? You might not have engaged in acts that you think are moral based on your upbringing, but you were doing service in a time for your country. It started, by just having him talk with his daughter, and then having him, before he could say the words, it was more comfortable for him to write them down, to write down his apology, his wish that he would have been a better father, his sorrow for the years when he wasn't around, and his sorrow that he's only returning in the last months of his life. But once he wrote them down, he realized, oh, I can say these things, that they are authentic to, my feelings, and they'll be in my words. But to make him feel safe in the moment, I had him just read what you wrote. Don't think you have to come up with it new off the top of your head, because the stress of the moment is going to make that too hard. When he had that conversation with his daughter, he was shocked at how easy forgiveness was from her. That he might have done some wrong things, but he was still dad. He wasn't a bad person. He was a person who had done bad things. And so that let him see, oh, maybe I'm not bad. Maybe I'm not evil. Maybe there is hope. Maybe there is redemption. That if my daughter can forgive me, maybe God can forgive me. And that was really profound for him. In working on his relationships, he was able to apologize to the wife, able to apologize to the family, and accept their forgiveness. So really, at the very end of his life, it was no longer that big moral weight weighing down upon his shoulders. It was more his gripes about the effect of the lactulose on him than, any of these moral burdens. And for those who aren't aware, end stage cirrhosis, lactulose can have some extreme gastric effects that, in order to keep the nitrogen levels low enough to have your cognitive function, you're going to have incredibly loose bowels. And a lot of folks with cirrhosis have big issues with it. But it was profound that it was those physical concerns that were roughest at the very end of life, because we could work through that soul injury and that moral injury and return a sense of personhood, of goodness in this patient. So, Michelle, what are your thoughts about that within the framework of soul injury and in moral injury?
As you were talking, you used the term shame. I do feel like, as I read this article, that that could very well be that in insidiously acquired wound is the shame. That was the commonality, I feel like, among the three. And so, when I'm looking at under soul injury, it says unmourned loss and hurt and unforgiven guilt and shame. So, or the fear of helplessness and loss of control. So that is, as I listen to you, that appears to be really the framework from which you did your work. So at what point had you, in your work with this man, did you realize that he had such a sense of unworthiness and inadequacy, and that he just was feeling disconnected because of it?
It was in the initial spiritual assessment where I'm looking for unresolved issues. What are the burdens at place? And he was very direct with his language that he was convinced that he was going to hell. When I have a patient who says that, it's clear that there is something unresolved and that there's something that they want to work out. And that's going to be my primary focus. And so when I teased out, why do you think that? Why do you think you're unforgivable? He was free with telling not the acute details of what happened, but saying, it was a result of his service, a result of abandoning his family to drink, because he just didn't want to feel, he didn't want to remember, he wanted to forget. That you could see the soul injury right from the get-go. And it was, my job as the chaplain to figure out what has to happen so he can feel that forgiveness. So that way he's not carrying that moral anxiety with him once he starts to actively transition, and, talking interventions would no longer be effective.
Yeah, that was incredible work you did with him. And multi-layered. I mean, that's the other piece that I'm thinking of as I recall this article in my mind, and I listened to you talk about this man, is that while soul injury, moral, and PTSD have their own categories, it's often far more complicated. They overlap, and that is for sure. And being able to kind of tease that out for someone can be very hard, because they often don't have that kind of awareness themselves. So, you know, I'm looking at the moral injury, and you know, that trust is a very big piece that it talks about. You know, belief, values, and separating one from a sense of trust in others or in themselves. So trust is huge. And at what point in your work with him did you begin to get a sense that he was starting to trust you to do this work with him?
That oftentimes for veterans, they already have an established understanding of the role of chaplain, since the military is engaged with chaplains, you know, for hundreds of years. So there's a sense of a chaplain as that benevolent moral authority who, just based on the role, can be trusted as a confidant, an advisor, someone who has moral character. And so I was lucky that I'm walking into a situation where I'm already in a role where this veteran has some modicum of trust for my position, even if not in me. So the rapport is able to be established more quickly. And you get that therapeutic alliance because they know what a chaplain is. It's a little bit different than the general population, where there has to be some education about the role of a chaplain and how it's different than other forms of religious leaders they've experienced. Um,
Yeah.
but it's providing that sense of safety, that the conversation is safe, that nothing is off limits, that he's not going to be rejected, that he can use the language he wants to use. Oftentimes, patients who come from occupations where rougher language is used, they'll start to apologize for the use of that language with me. And when I let them know, it's all right. It's nothing I haven't heard before. Just speak as you would speak. There's that sense of comfort in that sense of alliance that, oh, I can relate to him. Not only is he a moral authority, but he's one that's humanizing this experience. So I don't feel passively judged. And that's very important because the conversation needs to be non-judgmental.
Yes.
The moment that they feel a sense of shame from that moral authority, it's no longer benevolent, and it will cut down the capacity for any intervention to be effective.
Thank you. So I look at the category PTSD,
Mhm.
and we, as of late, they have been differentiating PTSD from a term they now call complicated PTSD, complex PTSD, and some groups call it developmental PTSD, which is really speaks to perhaps a situation of experiencing trauma early on in life.
Mhm.
But before uh, this level of understanding of PTSD, I remember, I want to say probably in the 80s, late 80s, and where they had identified what they felt was a complicated PTSD in the veterans, based on the knowledge that they had experienced earlier trauma and may well have come into the service with some vestiges of PTSD.
Mhm.
And then having experience what they experienced, it just compounded. And so it absolutely, it was one layer upon layer. And so they use the term complicated, meaning that these veterans were just overloaded with just all of this different level of trauma. So PTSD it does play a very large part of the overlap between soul and moral injury. I mean, trauma can absolutely result in dissociating from the self, a loss of sense of self, and also, as the article said, a sense of false self,
Mhm.
because you may feel yourself different, but you need to portray normalcy to the outside world, and so goes the issue of moral injury. So when did you have a sense that this man was struggling perhaps with some earlier history of trauma, or did you feel like the trauma really, that the base of his trauma was what he experienced in the military?
He didn't share any adverse childhood experiences, but I think he also realized he could only do so much in the time that he had remaining.
Yeah.
And a lot of that was around his feeling of shame, his feeling of unworthiness, of forgiveness, and the relationship with his daughter.
Yeah.
That if he could experience just forgiveness from her for his role as her father, he could come to some level of self-forgiveness for his actions. Um, but the moral framework he had that led him to feel shame for his actions in the service is a framework that's demonstrating, a typical moral formation of a person. That, anytime you have to do violence, extreme violence to another, if you have a properly formed moral character, it will be traumatic because your sense of yourself as a good person, as a, protector, as a defender, gets very much threatened when there's a situation where you're a perpetrator of violence.
Yes, and in fact, there are numerous articles that talk about shame with our veterans, and how that the breaks from their self um, is absolutely interrupts positive feelings,
Hmm.
and you just stay kind of stuck in that dark place. So, unfortunately for shame, it isn't so much something that you do as something you feel you are.
Hmm.
And so they,
That's a really important distinction. That's a a change of focus that is a must to realize I'm not a bad person. I might have done wrong things. Because if we live in the I'm a bad person, we live in that shame and that guilt, and there's no hope of possibility. There's no restoration because I am a bad person. It's when I have done wrong things, I can seek to make amends. I can seek restoration. I am a good person worthy of forgiveness. That that change of focus is everything when it comes to that moral self-repair.
yes, absolutely. And it sounds like a lot of his healing just revolved around um, forgiveness, and in particular, a re-establishing a connection with his daughter.
Mhm.
And so, um, how were you able to uncover with him the parts of himself that he felt safe to share with his daughter, and how he hoped to repair that?
Um, it was starting with just what's the language that would be authentic for him to say, I'm sorry, that I wish I could have done better, that not making excuses for what choices were made and actions were made, to just say, I wish I could have done better. I'm sorry, in a way that would be authentic for him.
Hmm.
That apologies are, in some ways, taking responsibility for your actions. And that's where excuses can get in the way of taking actual responsibility. That the choices were made under so many extenuating circumstances, but if he had to do it all over again, he would want it different. And that's the part that's important. And he was able to use it in his own language to say, I'm sorry, I wish I could have been a better father.
Mm-hmm.
And he didn't have to go into details with her. He didn't have to do that, secondary traumatization
Mm-hmm.
by overburdening her with his
Right.
past. He could just say, I'm sorry, and I wish I could have done it better. And she responded perfectly to that. That her forgiveness was there. And I was able to play on that by saying, your daughter, who's a human and imperfect as all humans are, is giving you this love and forgiveness. How can you conceive of a God who's less forgiving than your daughter? And
Uh,
that really tweaked something in his mind to be like, oh, if she forgives me, how can I think of a God as less loving than my daughter? Of course, forgiveness is available to me spiritually. And that was powerful. That if forgiveness from her would have been harder, I wouldn't have been able to go that same route. But it played out well for me.
and so at what part did you get the sense that I would imagine that was very pivotal, that moment,
Mhm.
and you making those comparisons, as you say, extremely powerful. Um, I mean, forgiveness in and of itself is so powerful, and it, it, it was that the turning point where you felt like he was beginning to forgive himself.
Yes, that if others could forgive him, then maybe he's worth redemption. His self-regard never was perfect, but it dramatically improved by restoring those relationships in his life.
Yes, um, and so certainly he must have had some aptitude towards some self-awareness, because he did a lot of work. He worked very hard. And so I think the piece that stands out for me as I listen to you describe your work is how you gave him permission to be human,
Mhm.
that he is a human, and that sometimes we make unhealthy choices as we try to cope, uh, but that's really all that we had at that moment. And how wonderful that he was able to move from that space into this space of love and forgiveness of himself and with his daughter. I mean, that work with him, I think it epitomizes um, what this article is all about. Um, and and how wonderful for the daughter and for the family in terms of I mean, you're not only doing this uncovering work with him towards forgiveness and acceptance, but this is a process of what I would call anticipatory grieving. um, it without the work you did with him and with her, she and the family may well have been facing a far more complicated bereavement, because
That
those issues would have been unsettled.
that prior to him returning to his family, they had already lost their father. They had already lost their husband. That he had he was alive, but he was gone, and there was no closure, and there was no restoration of relationship. There was no chance at apology and forgiveness. Those are all factors that can lead to a complex grief. Here, he was able to return, to apologize, to receive that forgiveness, to say those I love yous, and to say those I'm sorries. So that way, when it was time for him to die, there weren't those unsaid words. There wasn't that burden. And that's really important for our work in hospice, is to let people say what needs to be said, but also to restore the relationships that can be restored. So the end of life process doesn't have to be as frightening, doesn't have to be as anxiety laden, that folks can, receive the forgiveness that they can, and can also say, all of the I love yous that need to be said, because those words often aren't said often enough.
Right. And then at the end, this daughter was able to say goodbye to her father, and she'll have the ability, because you gave her the opportunity, to always evoke those memories of a loving father. And that kind of work we don't often get the chance to do.
Mhm.
So these things presented themselves, and I mean, this is also your aptitude and your ability to make use of those in that time frame. So as I look at the end of the article, I'm reading the treatment identified in each category. And I smiled to myself, because you, without any knowledge of this article, um, you facilitated this kind of movement. In treatment under soul injury is really about helping him to identify, some of these unresolved losses and hurts or injuries.
That
Um,
work in moral injury and soul injury has been emerging in the last decade as seminaries have started to engage with the military and military chaplaincy about the work of military chaplaincy, that you see in the work of Rita Nakashima Brock, and you see the work with Pamela Lightsey on that moral repair, that soul repair, the work with Shelley Rambo on trauma in chaplaincy, trauma in theology, that there's been an increased engagement to prepare chaplains for this kind of work, that it's different than the relationship that clergy in churches have with congregants, that there are more clinical tools now being offered for chaplains to prep them for success with this kind of patient.
yes, and as it turns out, the term spiritual counseling evokes certain understanding and awareness, but the work you did with him encompassed more sort of a eclectic use of other understandings about relationships and human behavior. And what's interesting to me is the underpinning of shame throughout this article. And shame is often called the soul killer,
Mhm.
because it splits pieces of yourself off. Um, um, and what happens is you start that false self. So you were able to do that with him. And under moral, discuss with trusted other who will not judge the action, was with the daughter and the family, dialogue with a benevolent moral authority. And these are all things that you did, Andrew, with this man. Methods of forgiveness and self-forgiveness. And under treatment for PTSD is everything that was involved with your work from the beginning, in the middle, and the end. So after having read this article, and obviously having a great deal of foreknowledge about the role of soul and moral injury in the care, being mindful of that in the care of our veterans. After reading this article, what are your thoughts about it? Did you find it helpful? Was it new information, or more of the same?
That I think this is necessary information for the professional development of a trained clinical chaplaincy, trained clinical social workers, that our awareness needs to extend beyond just PTSD, because there's elements of trauma that are present. But if you're only treating the PTSD symptoms, you're missing these other elements in the moral repair and the spiritual repair are necessary elements of chaplaincy. That we're not here just to say a few prayers, to offer some sprinkling of holy water or anointing with oil. That the work that we do needs to be helping reestablish that feeling of worth and goodness and dignity and humanity in our patients, realize that forgiveness is possible, in that redemption is possible, that those are the elements that allow for much more peaceful transitions at end of life. That, it's been said that we die as we lived. And if there's that trauma and that bitterness and that turmoil in life, that leads to some very unsettling end of life situations. And the power of chaplaincy is being able to pacify some of that.
Yes, because if I've learned anything, it's, giving people the opportunity to forgive or be forgiven is a strong drive. It is a spiritual soul need. And you sometimes just have to provide, the safety and the trust to enable them to reach that point. Well, I think we did cover quite a bit. Do you have anything else to add?
That I just want to thank all of the folks working with our service folks. Thank you to all of our veterans for the service you have provided to this country. And as part of Hospice and We Honor Veterans, we hope to support you to the best of our abilities.
Yes, and I want to thank those 5 nurses that began such dedicated, intense work and establishing with this very resourceful organization. I dare say they dedicated over at least half their lives. 30 years is a long time. So, all right, well, thank you, Andrew.
Thank you, Michelle.